Their daughter was stillborn and her parents gave thanks, but the reason will surprise you. This baby was stillborn and her parents were devastated. You won't believe what happened next. Friends, this is a true story. Carla was a girl from a poor background. She lived in a very small house that was falling apart for as long as she could remember, and the conditions there were unsanitary due to lack of resources. Her family spent long periods of time in which they had almost nothing to eat. They were in great need and had to constantly endure the scorn of people for believing them to be inferior and little. Carla was the only daughter of Cecilia, a woman who has heart problems since she was very young. She met Carla's father when she was 16, thought she had found the love of her life, and the two dated for a couple of years. However, as soon as Cecilia became pregnant, the man showed his true colors. He started drinking and became extremely violent with his wife. He humiliated her and constantly blamed her for not taking care of herself and having to carry a child he did not want. During the pregnancy, Cecilia's husband Carlos would party all night with friends and arrive with his clothes smelling of women's perfume. It didn't take his wife long to realize that he was being unfaithful. Not with one, but with several women, so Cecilia suffered a lot. At times, she even fainted, as the impressions did not do her heart or her pregnancy any good. The woman took the courage she needed and confronted Carlos. She was terrified because she knew she was going to be alone and she had no money and no job. Full of fear, she asked her husband to leave the house and never come back. Carlos began to laugh and told her that she was doing him a favor by relieving him of the burden she and the girl represented for him. He left, and Cecilia had to go through every kind of need. She had almost nothing to eat. She was about to finish her pregnancy and nobody would give her a job because of her condition, so she started begging for money on the street, trying to collect some coins to keep her daughter alive until she could give birth. Cecilia delivered her daughter at home, knowing that she could die with no help from anyone and no medical assistance of any kind. In addition, her heart was being affected by the great labor of giving birth, and during labor, Cecilia fainted several times. Nevertheless, she managed to give birth to Carla, and to her surprise, the baby girl was completely healthy. Carla grew up to be a beautiful and joyful little girl. Her mother did everything she could to keep her daughter from going through so much need. She had gotten a job, but it paid very little, and was only enough to cover some food and secondhand clothes for her little girl. The mother was gripped with worry. Her daughter was very thin and malnourished. She wasn't going to school because she couldn't afford to pay for it, let alone give her what she needed to attend, so she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. When Carla turned 8, her mother took her to a boarding school that was supported by the state. There, Carla would receive food, shoes, supplies, and an education, but she had to stay there alone, and her mother could only visit her every Sunday. When her mother left her in that place, the little girl cried and screamed heart-rendingly, for she knew that she had been left all alone, with no guarantee her mother would come back. Her mother's visits became so infrequent that she barely saw her mother once a month. However, Carla tried to stay cheerful. Whenever she felt lonely or missed her mother, she loved to sing and did it beautifully. In that way, she managed to stay cheerful and get ahead. In the boarding school room, Carla had a window that looked out onto a very luxurious building, and she would stare out the window, imagining that she lived in one of those apartments. She imagined with great excitement a wonderful life, a loving husband, children, and the happy home she never had. When Carla turned 18, she was finally able to leave boarding school. She had completed her studies and learned several trades. She was ready to enter college and return to the humble home her mother had worked hard to buy. She got a good job and finished her university studies, but living with her mother was terrible because she never forgave her for having abandoned her, and she constantly reproached her for how lonely she'd felt all those years. Sometime later, she met a kind-hearted man named Javier. He was hardworking and very handsome, and they fell madly in love. He gave her the support and security she had never felt before. They married, and together they tried to get ahead despite everything. Carla was a faithful believer in God, loved to serve in her local church alongside her husband, and prayed fervently as she wanted to fill her heart and forgive her mother for the decisions she'd made on the brink of despair. Eventually, Carla became pregnant with a baby girl. They both wanted their daughter with the greatest love they have to offer her. For Carla, the news represented great joy, but it also filled her with bitter sadness as she remembered all the needs she had experienced as a child with her mother. She realized that she had been too harsh and that her mother had only made the decisions to try to protect her and save her from that life of misery which no child should have to live. Carla sought out her mother and asked her forgiveness for holding a grudge for so long, and thanked her for leaving her at that boarding school. She understood that Cecilia had no choice. She just wanted to have a better future despite everything. Carla loved her mother, and the news that she would have a baby girl filled her with joy. Unfortunately, her mother's heart problems had worsened and she did not have long to live. Carla finally felt peace in her heart and tried to enjoy her last days at their mother's side. She took care of her and took care of everything she needed. A few days later, her mother asked her daughter for a favor that moved her to tears. Cecilia asked her to choose the name of her granddaughter as her last wish before leaving. Carla agreed to fulfill her mother's wish, and they both hugged and cried because they knew the name of the little girl who was on her way would unite them forever. Her name would be Rose. Shortly after giving birth, Carla and her husband met with friends from their local church for lunch. That day, the couple's pastor told them that Rose's name meant that she would be a little flower that sprouts in the desert, and that even though she would die, she would be able to rise again. After the meeting, the couple pondered what they'd been told, and were thankful that for them, their little Rose would be the flower that would bring life to their family. That was what they had understood with those words. What happened next, however, would mark them forever. The day of the delivery finally arrived. Carla counted on her husband every step of the way. Fortunately, they had great doctors who would help them deliver their baby safe and sound. The baby was born, and there was no crying. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room became quite overwhelming. Carla and her husband were crying, asking God for a miracle for their baby girl to be able to breathe. At that moment, Carla and Javier remembered the words of their pastors and they understood. It would be fulfilled just as he told them. Rose would be the flower that even though she was dead, she would be resurrected. They both began to pray and trusted that God would do his will, for only he could save their little girl. After a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity, Rose's crying flooded the room and all the medical staff began to cry. Everyone was deeply moved by the miraculous experience they just witnessed. Carla and her husband could not have been happier because their little girl had come back to life. Days later, they returned home, grateful for the miracle that God had granted them, and Carla recalled with nostalgia those days when she longed for everything she had today while looking out that window. Friends, this is the end of our story. What did you think? Leave us your opinion below in the comments and hit the like button. See you next time.